Let's take a look at the methodology of the 1930s pollsters. The three pollsters of 1936 all claimed a scientific basis for their research to distinguish it from the straw polls or purposive sampling traditions of market research. But what they meant by this was that they had constructed a national quota sample selected to match demographic characteristics of individuals and to be geographically national in scope and coverage. But it was not a probability sample in the modern sense at all. It's worth noting that the quota samples were not generally seen as scientifically suspect at the time, but rather as a reasonable concession to practicality. This reached so far as pollsters and others using published tables of margin of error, which were used despite the fact that this was not really a probability sample. That discrepancy wasn't seen as really critical, and indeed some of the scientific advisors to government and others publicly viewed the quota sampling basis of these polls as adequate. But that fell a far ways from the reality of what sampling in these quota samples really were about. The sampling was usually left to the interviewer's discretion. While they had to fill a certain quota of men and women, A, B, C, and D class respondents, or urban and rural areas, the discretion that was given to interviewers and the lack of a notion of an explicit sampling frame, let alone objectively selected sample elements, that stuff was virtually non-existent. I think a vivid example comes from a description of one of the participants. This is written by a person who went on to have a career in survey research, but who worked as an interviewer in 1937. And he describes his technique from that period. I quote, "The interview was very simple, just the front and back of a single page. In those days, the way I would fill my relief quotas was to walk around town until I saw a WPA construction gang, and I would get them on their lunch hour, 3 or 4 men sitting around eating their sandwiches and drinking their beer. I'd pull out my questionnaire and say, 'Do you approve or disapprove of a treaty with Germany?' or whatever. And then I'd say, 'How about you? And you? And you?' I got 4 interviews very quickly that way. I would go to parks, good places to find people, mothers with their children, old men sitting around. I would go to train terminals and bus stations. You couldn't find many A-level people this way, so you'd have to screw up your courage and go through a fancy part of town and try to figure out which house looked the most approachable. This is the way the sampling and the interviewing went." Now, that's an interesting example of the reality of quota sampling, one that may have picked locations in order to spread and cover the country as a whole, and certainly one that was aware of what percentage of male and female A, B, C, and D class people should be included in the sample, but one that really left so much discretion to the part of the interviewer as to upset any possibility of objective sampling. Indeed, the quote itself mentions the approachable houses for those A-class respondents. It seems clear in retrospect that given so much discretion, interviewers would approach some types of people and not others. Those that appeared to be likely to give an interview, who were also convenient and who fit in the quota, were more likely to be interviewed, and those who seemed unapproachable or difficult to contact would be left out of the sample. The description makes clear the potential problems of quota sampling. If we add in the results of Gini and Galvani that were cited by Neyman in his 1934 article, which showed the failures of using what amounted to quota methods by matching on even several census variables, it's clear that while quota samples were far more varied than earlier purposive samples or panels, the danger of non-probability methods was all too apparent. what awaited was a moment in which the biases from quota samples would be correlated with vote. When that happened, the difficulties would be all too apparent. The 1936 election launched Gallup and Roper to preeminence in the world of public opinion polling. Their demonstrated success that year and Gallup's bold July challenge to the Literary Digest gave great credibility to their work, and newspapers and magazines provided a lucrative outlet to spread their work and to the broad public of readers. It's also worth noting that both pollsters, though Gallup in particular, saw the civic virtues of public opinion polls as an instrument for democracy. By measuring public opinion based on representative samples, polling could inform elected officials of public views to a far more accurate extent than previously possible. Like the progressives behind the American social surveys of the turn of the century, Gallup and Roper also saw a higher purpose to their work. While easily denigrated as horse race polling and marketing, the role of the poll as a tool for a democratic society was an explicit consideration at the birth of polling. This rise of the pollsters in the 1936 election set the stage for the next developments in survey research. That stage had to await the rise of probability polling and the disaster of the 1948 election polls. We'll be back with those next time.